Hi, I'm Catherine from America Abroad Media. Today I'm with Ambassador James Dobbins and Alex Thier of the United States Institute for Peace. We're going to be talking about the Afghan elections. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. I'd just like to start out with the vote totals for President Karzai. How accurate are the reports that Karzai has won a clear majority when only 10% of the votes have come in?
And I think there's actually been a marked contrast in the reporting today where his finance minister reported something like 68% based on figures that people that I've talked to in the electoral process don't know where he's getting those figures from. But clearly from what's been officially released, Karzai and Abdullah are neck and neck. I think one thing that we do know is that the reports that I got today from Kabul is that that vote count doesn't include the South. So that could suggest higher turnout for Karzai in the South, but at the same time, the reports also indicate that voting in the South was quite low. That does indicate that people didn't feel that they could get out and vote, whether due to apathy, security reasons, some combination of the two, and that could potentially affect the legitimacy.
So if Karzai is reelected then, what do you expect the Obama administration approach to Karzai's new administration to be?
Well, I think that they will try to urge him to be both inclusive in selection of his cabinet and more decisive in terms of disciplining elements of his government that are either lethargic or corrupt or incompetent. So there definitely will be, I think, an effort to reach out to others, including the principal opponents of Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, and possibly even bringing them into the government. But at the same time, the U.S. and the international community will be urging Karzai to be more discriminating in who he chooses and more diligent in ensuring that his ministers are up to the job and doing what they're supposed to be.
I agree with Jim completely that that's what the American administration will do. I think the problem with that is that during this election campaign, Karzai has turned to people like his first vice president, like Rashid Dostum, who he brought back from Turkey, who I think are essentially not good agents for that kind of strategy. The idea that he owes those people his reelection, and yet that he's going to somehow come up with a much cleaner administration, I think are somewhat in tension with each other. And so I think that the great challenge for the U.S. government is going to be to figure out how to use its leverage effectively with Karzai to achieve that objective when, at the same time, Karzai feels that he doesn't owe his reelection to the United States government, but rather to those people whose support he sought during the re-election campaign.
Well, the only other candidate that seems a plausible contestant would be Abdullah. Abdullah is a very competent person, very smart, and the U.S. has worked closely and effectively with him in the past, so he's a known quantity. Because he's more closely associated with the Tajik and Uzbek and Hazara minorities, and in particular with the Tajiks, and in particular with the Panjshiri element of the Tajiks, he's going to have a greater problem than Karzai establishing an administration that's perceived as representative. And it'll be even more important in his case for him to reach out to particularly Pashtun elements of Karzai's constituency and bring them into his government if his election is not to have a very divisive effect on the country.
Now, I'd like to speak about something that Admiral Mullen recently said. He said that the situation in Afghanistan is serious and deteriorating. The Obama administration is already losing popular and congressional support for the war in Afghanistan. How will the legitimacy of this election affect the support for the war here at home in the United States?
I mean, I think that it's considerable. I think that the most important aspect of this is actually the perception of the Afghan population. If we come through this election with what is already declining support from the Afghan population for its own government, if we come through this election with a government whose legitimacy is further tainted by a negative outcome, then we really risk having a population that no longer strongly supports the government, doesn't feel invested in it. And that doesn't mean that they immediately become pro-Taliban, but it does mean that they're less likely to risk for the government. They're less likely to go out in favor of support for the government. And I think by extension, that also means that the U.S. and the international community, with additional troops, appears increasingly to be propping up an Afghan government that's unpopular. And that's really the worst case scenario.
Looking back at the last presidential elections in Afghanistan, there's been a great change in TV and media and cell phone usage amongst Afghans. Do you think that's contributed to growth in their political literacy? Do you think they've become better voters?
Well, it's certainly more of a contest this time than last time. Whether that's due to, as you suggest, more exposure is hard to say. I think last time there was an element of novelty in the electoral process that's lacking this time, and perhaps an element of hope that the turnaround and reconstruction would proceed more rapidly than it did.
Talking about voting behaviors, there was a noticeably low turnout of women in this election. How do you think this lack of women voters affected the election totals?
Well, I think one of the most dramatic aspects of women's rights as it played out in this campaign was the passage of the infamous Shia law, the Shia family law. This was a law that was drafted by conservative members of parliament to pertain to the Shia minority, 15 to 20% of the population, and had some famously bad clauses that allowed, for instance, marital rape, and that President Obama even called abhorrent. And this appeared to have disappeared because of international outcry. And then it turns out that President Karzai actually signed this law not even through the parliament, but actually as a midnight decree when the parliament was in recess, that had made some of the changes, but many of the most objectionable problems were still there. And so I think that this was, again, in a bid in many ways to get the support of that community for his reelection. And the unfortunate thing is that I think that he clearly was willing to sacrifice some advances or at least some of the ground in the debate over women's rights in Afghanistan for a fairly short-term gain.
The constituency that Karzai was appealing to was strongly anti-Taliban. The Shia minority in Afghanistan is completely against the Taliban. So this was not an appeal to the Taliban constituency. It was an appeal to the anti-Taliban constituency, which also had a conservative view of the role of women, which indicates that the country isn't split between a conservative Taliban on the one hand and a progressive elements of society on the other. It's more complex, and the society is more broadly conservative, including large elements of the anti-Taliban coalition.
In a Guardian interview with an Afghan voter earlier this week, the Afghan voter said, "We are lacking a strong national leader, a person who works for Afghanistan." Has this election moved Afghanistan towards that goal?
I think that it's critical that this election is seen to be about leadership. And that's not only about who comes out, whether it's Karzai or Abdullah in the end. The most important outcome, I think, of this election has to be that whoever wins is going to begin to exert leadership in a way that puts the Afghans more in charge of their own future and in a way that is sustainable.